Theresa May's been pretty firm, hasn't she, that she doesn't think there should be another Brexit vote. Do you think she'll get her way?
Well, the government needs to bring its deal back to Parliament as soon as possible, ideally early next week. The government withdrew it summarily at the start of this week, has given no reason at all why it's not planning to bring it back next week. The Prime Minister was in Brussels last week trying to get the assurances and the changes to the deal that she's been seeking, but has been met with a flat no. It's now time for Parliament to move on. We need to get on with it and move this to a conclusion.
Well, it's pretty clear why they're not bringing it to the House. It's because they'd lose it, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think it's clear that the Prime Minister is now running the clock. Her strategy is to kick the can down the road, but in my view, that's completely unacceptable. We can't be presented with two bad choices. Her deal on the one hand, flawed fundamentally, and the chaos and disruption of no deal. We've got to do better than that as a country, and that's why I think it's really important we now go back to the people and ask them whether they want to proceed with Brexit on the negotiated basis that the Prime Minister is recommending, or whether they want to reconsider.
Well, let's talk about the possibility of a second referendum, because there were reports around this morning, as I referred to in the introduction to the interview, that two of Theresa May's closest allies have been sounding people out, have been effectively wargaming what would happen if there was a second referendum. Now, Gavin Barwell, the Chief of Staff, has tweeted to say that he doesn't want a second referendum. What's your sense? Have you been having conversations with those two men?
Well, it's quite appropriate for him to say he doesn't want a second referendum. No one, of course, would want to have to reopen this question. But the reality is her deal is not going to be acceptable to Parliament, and we're going to be presented with the alternative of crashing out, which is also unacceptable to Parliament. In that situation, we're going to need a plan B, and I think the best plan B is to go back to the people and say, we now know what Brexit is because we've spent 2.5 years negotiating this deal. If you want this deal, it's available and we can do Brexit on this basis. But if you don't, you have the option of staying in on our current terms.
So I know that that's what you think about. I'm interested to know whether that's what the Cabinet thinks and whether that's what the government thinks. Have you had any conversations with people that made you think that there is a shift perhaps towards the possibility of a second referendum?
Well, it's now abundantly clear her deal's not going to get through Parliament. There have been no changes made to it in Brussels to make it more acceptable to MPs. So there are conversations about, well, what is going to have to come next? And to my mind, there are very few other options that are going to work.
So who are those conversations happening between them?
Well, MPs are talking to each other all the time, and inevitably you're going to be talking to Cabinet Ministers as well. So, of course, MPs are talking about what on earth we're going to do. We've spent 2.5 years negotiating a deal which is going to be completely unacceptable to Parliament. We have to find a way through. And to my mind, going back to the people and asking them to give the final say on whether they want to do Brexit on this basis or not is the right way to go.
So how many members of the Cabinet do you think would be open to the idea of a second referendum?
Well, look, I don't want to get into a numbers game. I think everything is fluid. And I think the moment that she takes the plunge and brings her deal back to Parliament and sees it defeated, I think that will clarify thinking for a lot of MPs and Cabinet Ministers.
Now, you're pretty clear in your support for another vote. You were born and bred in London. You represent Orpington, a constituency in Greater London. Do you think you really understand why people outside of the capital voted to leave the EU and the deep sense of betrayal that many of those people would feel if that vote was ignored and it was like, oh, actually, we're just going to do it again?
Well, I think this is the big challenge. We need to understand the causes of Brexit and why people voted as they did, and that includes people in my own constituency who voted for leave. It's, of course, important that they are listened to and we get to treat the real causes of Brexit. And I don't think leaving the EU is the answer. Listen, I think the fundamental point is that if we implement the Prime Minister's deal, that is going to be the ultimate betrayal of the people who voted to leave the European Union. And the reason for that is it does not deliver on the promises of the 2016 referendum. It will not enable us to do trade deals of any meaningful nature. It will not enable us to take back control. On the contrary, we're going to be ceding control over huge swathes of our economy and have no say at all in how they're made. At the moment, we're an equal participant in the structures of the EU. We will cease to be. We'll be a passive rule taker on the outside. And lastly, the people who advocated Brexit said we would have an ability to turn ourselves into a sort of a tiger economy on the edge of Europe. We're not going to be able to do that under the deal she's putting forward, the Prime Minister's putting forward,
so
because we will be taking all the rules of the single market, but we won't have any say in how they're made anymore. It's a nonsense.
So what do you think should be on the ballot paper if there was a second referendum? Because I'll be honest with you, I've spoken to lots of people who advocate a second vote, and I seem to be getting a different answer every time.
Parliament will frame the question when it legislates for a referendum. To my mind, you've got a few options which are obvious. You've got her deal, the Prime Minister's deal, which has been negotiated. It's a 585-page legal treaty with a 26-page waffly political declaration, but at least it's there. You've got our current arrangements within the EU, so that's remain effectively. And then I think the onus is on the Brexiteers who want a harder form of Brexit to define that for themselves. It shouldn't be the onus should not be on people like me to define what hard Brexit is. If they want to advocate in Parliament for a WTO-style relationship, fine, then they can make the case in Parliament and get that question on the ballot paper as well. But the onus should be on the hard Brexiteers after 2.5 years to define what they actually mean. I think it tells you a lot about the lack of clarity and the lack of plan on the hard Brexit side, that 2.5 years into this whole project, we still don't actually have a clear answer from the hard Brexit team as to what they would actually like to see on the ballot paper.
Well, I think some of them may argue that it would be, leaving on WTO rules.
But others are arguing for Super Canada, Canada plus, plus, plus. I mean, they're not exactly the same. They're variants of each other, but they're not the same.
OK. Now, you've been pretty scathing of her deal. The Prime Minister faced a confidence motion in Parliament. How did you vote?
I don't comment on leadership. I took a decision when I entered Parliament in 2010 that I was never going to comment on leadership questions, not least because people would assume I was sort of bringing family issues into it. I don't want to get dragged into any of that, and I'm not going to start now. OK. At the same time, though, it's quite difficult to separate the Prime Minister from the policy. Are you worried that she's not really listening enough to the concerns of parliamentarians? Yes, I am worried. That's why I think it's really important that she brings the debate back. We suspended a 5-day debate after 3 days. We've got to continue that debate next week on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. Have the vote on her deal so that we can all move on and then move on to the next step of this process, which is to ask the public whether they want to go ahead and do Brexit on the negotiated basis that we spent 2.5 years preparing. And if they want to do that, fine, we can go ahead with the Prime Minister's deal and implement that. But we can't waste any more time. We've got precious little time left. And the time for fantasy renegotiations of the package to sort of get to Canada plus, 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 or Norway plus, or all these other different variations that are out there, that time has come and gone. We've got a deal on the table. It's the only deal on the table. And now is the time for Parliament to decide and then to put it back to the people for them to confirm whether they want to do Brexit on that basis or not. I mean, you're saying Norway's fantasy, you say Canada's fantasy. I mean, is the Prime Minister's current deal a fantasy in that it won't get through Parliament either? Well, the Prime Minister's deal has the virtue of at least having been negotiated. It's got many, many flaws, and it's not in not in our national interest to do it. The other schemes, Canada Plus, Norway Plus, they haven't even been negotiated. We don't even know whether they could be negotiated, certainly in any relevant time frame. And I think the time has come for us, after 2.5 years, to try and give certainty that people in my constituency in Orpington are looking for, businesses all over the country are looking for, and to put this to rest once and for all. Now, you mentioned these pesky interviews asking you about family issues, so I'll apologise in advance for my next question. But in an interview yesterday, you said of your brother, Boris Johnson, who campaigned to leave the EU, his force of personality papered over the absence of any deliverable plan. So do you think that Brexit wouldn't have happened then if it hadn't been for your brother? Well, I think he was a very prominent campaigner for Brexit, and I think he played a part in getting the country over the line. There's no doubt about that. He and others like Michael Gove and other big prominent figures of the Leave campaign, yes, of course, they were really influential in the debate. And of course, Brexit has been a pretty divisive issue for many families. Do you think there'll be a few awkward moments for the Johnson family this Christmas? Look, actually, we're united as a family right now in dismay at the deal that's on the table from the government. Our priority, my priority, is to ensure that we don't take an irrevocable step by accepting this bad deal. It's not in our national interest, and I think it's really important we think again before we do that. OK. Jo Johnson, thank you very much.